A recent Gallup poll found that 62% of Americans think the news media favors a political party. That is an astounding number. It's true that major media outlets need clicks and eyeballs to stay afloat, so they do whatever they can to keep you glued to what they're saying. And this usually means they do a lot of fear-mongering, but very little real analysis of what's truly going on in the world. If you want to know what's really going on, then Geopolitical Futures report, The World in 2018 is for you. If you subscribe to GPF today, you'll receive this special report, and you'll also receive an exclusive bonus only available right now, the audio series from our recent conference, Rising and Falling Powers. Click on the link below in the description right away, as this offer is ending very soon. Now let's turn to an issue that could undo any sort of positive economic impact the new Trump tax plan has in store. The North American Free Trade Agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico is about to enter yet another round of negotiations. However, both Canada and Mexico are publicly more and more pessimistic about where things are going. Just take a look at this clip of Justin Trudeau taken just earlier this week.
There's people thinking about our place in the world and how Canada is, dealing with a somewhat unruly neighbor these days. Maybe not unruly, maybe unpredictable sometimes.
So to analyze what's going on, I have Dr. George Friedman joining me from Austin, Texas. Dr. Friedman, what is happening with the North American Free Trade Agreement? What are the latest developments, and what do they tell you about the path that all the parties are on?
Well, what's going on is a negotiation. And in any negotiation, everybody is going to say, this isn't going to work, I'm walking. There's no one who goes to negotiation and says, my God, I've got to have this deal, I'm going to do this deal no matter what the price. So the idea that you're going to have a renegotiation of a complex treaty, and at various points, everybody isn't going to threaten to walk, is just unrealistic. That's not how negotiations take place. Now, sometimes they break down, but the mere fact that people are posturing and planning, saying it's hopeless and planning for the future without it, doesn't mean it's over. It means we're getting to the point where really important issues are being discussed.
Okay, well look, here in Canada, I'm in Vancouver, there are very pessimistic signals coming out of the mouths of a lot of policymakers. Namely, they're saying, look, we have to prepare for the fact that the US may indeed pull out of NAFTA. Why don't you give it a percentage? What chance do you see of the US potentially pulling out of NAFTA?
Well, I think that's extremely unlikely, regardless of whether Trump wants to or not. And I think one of the great things about this entire affair is it'll finally give Canadians and Mexicans and Cambodians a chance to understand how the United States actually operates. Because everybody's fixated on the Prime Minister of Canada, and he's very powerful. The President of the United States is not nearly so powerful, as we've seen with legislation after legislation being shot down, as we've seen with the court system blocking the president in every which way. So the first thing to begin with is, no, the president does not decide what's going to happen. Even if it says in the law that he can, the next thing that'll happen as soon as he does is around 10,000 lawsuits will inundate the American legal system for many, many different reasons, because this is a complicated situation, and that'll put that to a stop. Then you have the political facts, and the most important political fact is this. 2 states in the Union have Mexico as their #1 export partner. The largest is California, a Democratic state, absolutely opposed to leaving NAFTA. The second largest is Texas. Also, most of its leaders opposed to leaving NAFTA, a Republican state. So you have the largest Democratic delegation and the largest Republican delegation. Neither of them want to leave NAFTA. You have a legal system that's going to shut them down. And what the president wants or doesn't want isn't going to matter a whole lot. Which isn't to say that a lot of people who are involved in this question don't want to renegotiate parts of NAFTA. We've noticed that the Canadians are very happy to want to renegotiate those parts that matter to them, particularly on lumber. Mexicans want to talk about agriculture. We have things we want to talk about. This treaty needs to be renegotiated. And if you're really serious about renegotiating it, what you're going to do is stand up from the table and say, I'm leaving. Because until you are taken seriously, there's not going to be a negotiation. And I think what the Canadians did this week, in a kind of strange way, is try to make it clear that they're prepared to walk from the table, and the U.S. had better be careful. And the U.S. is being careful in its own odd way.
Interesting point. So just today, or I guess it was late last night, the Mexican government essentially said that if Donald Trump announces that the U.S. is pulling out of NAFTA, and essentially what that does is just trigger a clause in NAFTA that starts the ball rolling to the U.S. pulling out, if the Trump administration were to announce that, Mexico leaves the table. You think that that's a bluff, obviously.
Well, if they leave the table, they leave their largest customer. And I doubt very much the Mexicans are eager to leave the largest customer that they have. So it's useful the day before it happens to make these threats. The day after, you're going to have to carry them out. So it's interesting to watch the Mexicans and the Canadians all making threats that they don't yet have to carry out. So that if Trump says this, they don't have to make a threat that it's time to go. Everybody's trying to set themselves up here. The point is, Mexico badly needs NAFTA, and it'd be a disaster for Mexico. It would be very damaging to Canada. It would hurt the United States. But you're talking about the two weaker players threatening to leave the table when they don't have to, because they know perfectly well that whatever Trump announces is far, far, far from away from being law. So they are very knowledgeably focusing on a statement, if Trump makes it, that will have very little impact for a very long time. And it's just negotiation. And it's really important to understand that it's perfectly acceptable to do these things. And in negotiation, it is perfectly acceptable to scare the living daylights out of everybody. The problem that the Mexicans have and the Canadians have is that they're scaring the heck out of their own people. The United States, interestingly enough, it's kind of washing over the states. The states have basically said, as far as I can tell, I don't speak to everybody obviously, NAFTA is not going away, we're just going to renegotiate it. And they've ignored it. They've heard these things coming from Canada. The Canadians didn't exactly scare the Americans. It was noted that it was said. Mexicans even less. So you have the two weak parties making the threats, as you'd expect. The stronger party is really impervious to it in many ways. So the really interesting question is, if Trudeau and this unknown spokesman who spoke to Reuters actually panic Canadian people, which way do the Canadian people stampede? Do they stampede in an anti-American direction, which they probably will at first, or will after a while they say to their government, hey, look guys, you can't walk away from the table. They're playing with fire here, but Trudeau is an excellent politician. I'm sure he knows what he's doing. From my point of view, I'm not impressed by the threats. And if they were to be carried out, the American Republic would survive. And that is the thing the Canadians and Mexicans have to consider. They can have a deal, it's not going to be broken, but filing World Trade Organization sanctions against the United States, which the Canadians have done, I don't know exactly where Trudeau thinks he's going to wind up with that.
Well, look, there is a perception in Canada that what really lies behind Trump's opposition to NAFTA is Mexico, and that if the U.S. does happen to pull out of NAFTA, that a bilateral agreement will be quickly worked out between Canada and the U.S. But essentially, the main issues with NAFTA that Trump and the rest of the Trump administration has are actually with Mexico. To what degree is that true or not true?
Well, the interesting thing is it was true. And as the Canadians have become more and more aggressive, Canada is being more and more noticed as a problem as well. We have a problem with Mexico, but we also have 40% of all the parts of cars manufactured in Detroit being produced in Mexico. We have a deep interdependence with Mexico. We have one with Canada as well. The president opened this up by saying he is going to withdraw. The Canadians are deliberately taking this much more seriously than it should be, not because Trump isn't serious, but because Trump's track record shows that he doesn't get what he wants. And as for which one of the countries the U.S. is more concerned about, well, it's these actions that we hear from the World Trade Organization, to those of us who are even listening, that make us wonder whether or not our relationship with Canada is what it should be.
Interesting. Okay, final question for you. Where does this opposition to NAFTA that's coming obviously from the Trump administration and a lot of the folks that obviously voted for Trump and even some who didn't, where does this fit into the global picture in terms of what we've seen with Brexit? We've just had Nigel Farage, a former politician in the UK, say, I think it was yesterday, essentially that maybe there should be a second referendum to determine whether the UK should proceed with Brexit or not. But where does this nationalistic essentially strain that we see moving through some of Western politics, where does this whole NAFTA dispute, where does this lie in that whole milieu?
Well, there has been a religion of free trade. And that religion held that in the long run, free trade benefits everyone. And that may be true, but it leaves out two questions. How long does it take to benefit everyone, and where does this wealth go to? In much of the European American world, free trade has worked out so that the GDP grew. The money flowed to the upper classes. The efficiencies that were created left an awful lot of jobless. And so the assumption that free trade is always beneficial, well, the benefits may never be for this generation or even their children. So in this part, what we are really seeing is a questioning of what was the orthodoxy since World War II. And this is a reasonable thing to do. I mean, people are asking a reasonable question. The enemy, those who want to oppose any questioning of free trade, try to paint these people as kind of cavemen. But it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask of whether or not our relationship with Mexico or our relationship to Canada, as it's currently structured, is beneficial. Just as it's perfectly reasonable for the Canadians to ask this question, or the Mexicans to ask these questions, all these questions being asked. What is unhealthy about the Europeans is that it's not just a free trade issue. It's a question of governance. Who governs the internal affairs of the various countries? The good thing about us is we never went that route. This is a pure free trade agreement. The Canadians govern themselves as they want. Washington has nothing to do with that. Mexico governs themselves as they want. We are sovereign, independent countries. And what you're seeing is sovereign, independent countries looking at their electorates, listening to what they're saying, and trying to adjust this deal accordingly. This is called democracy. And it's called national self-determination, which we all support. So my view is that we had overplayed the multilateralism. We had overplayed the free trade concept. It had unfortunate effects, and now the system is correcting it. And part of this is the discussion of NAFTA, carried out, as you would expect, as if it were an opera, waiting for the fat lady to sing. It goes on, but in the end, it's a reasonable conversation that we should be having and are having.
Final question for you, George, and this is a big picture question here. We see China taking advantage of the fact that the Trump administration decided to pull out of the TPP. China, I mean, obviously the TPP was set up to contain China to a certain extent. And when Trump pulled out, obviously, all these countries that had negotiated with the United States in good faith realized, can we really depend on the U.S. and start taking a closer look at China? Let's just say worst case scenario happens with NAFTA and somehow the thing falls apart. Where does China fit into this? I know that you and I have had personal discussions about it, that China and Canada are negotiating a free trade agreement right now. It's not necessarily going that well, but they are talking. And obviously China has a lot of trade with Mexico. Where does this current negotiation with NAFTA fit into the bigger picture of China rising in the world?
Well, we use the term trade. Let's use exports and imports. China is a net exporter. So are all the other countries of TPP. In Europe, Germany is a net exporter, and so is every country. The advantage of NAFTA is the United States is a net importer. So free trade with China, for Canada, for example, would mean a massive inflow of goods into Canada. How much the Chinese would be buying from Canada is open to question. The reason that the U.S. pulling out of TPP doesn't leave China in a powerful position is that China, in the end, exports way more than it imports. Vietnam exports way more than it exports. All these countries are massive exporters. So a free trade coalition of exporters has all the competitors sitting in one room. Who's the customer?
Good point. George, final question for you, very final, and only one word answer here. Is NAFTA going to be renegotiated and going to continue, or do you see it dying? Yes or no?
NAFTA will be there. It might be called something different, but we are going to have free trade zones in North America.
Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.